Welcome everybody to the latest in our Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub webinar series, where today our topic is Reforming Ukraine, Actors, Scrutiny and Change. The question of reforms and Ukraine's future has taken on a different hue recently since Donald Trump became the United States president again. And I think it's fair to say that that has raised some concerns among Europeans about the future of Ukraine. Nonetheless, economic and governance reforms were underway well before February 2022, and post-war reconstruction will be an opportunity to progress reform efforts at a renewed pace. So in this webinar, we will think about the reform pathway that Ukraine is moving along and what needs to happen from here, and perhaps oversight and coordination efforts in those reforms, and how they entail both actors inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. To discuss this topic, we have 4 speakers who will each have 10 minutes to make some initial remarks, and then we will have question and answers session. I'll introduce the speakers properly before they deliver their initial remarks, but briefly, they are Katarina Wolczuk, Katia Lozka, Olena Miliienko, and Berend de Groot. There is interpretation into Belarusian available in the webinar. If you want to hear Belarusian, then please click on the globe icon in the control panel. If you, the session is also being recorded, so it should be treated as on the record, and it will be uploaded tomorrow both to our website, warwick.ac.uk/webhub, and also to our YouTube channel. You can submit your questions at any time in the Q&A box, and I will ask those to the speakers on your behalf. If you would like to be identified, please write your name and affiliation at the end of your question in the box. So our first speaker today is Katarina Wolczuk, who is Professor of East European Politics at the University of Birmingham in the UK, as well as an Associate Fellow with the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Professor Wolczuk has written extensively about Ukraine, including on constitutional reform, its governance institutions, and state building. She is also a specialist on Ukraine's relations with the European Union. Katarina, I know that you have been studying processes of change and reforms in Ukraine across the whole period from the 1990s and through the 2000s. So perhaps you could give us, please, an overview of Ukraine's experience with reforms to this point and what needs to be done in the future. You have 10 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to speak in such a nice company. And indeed, the topic seems to be very topical, and it has been discussed extensively. And it's interesting that we talk about post-war reconstruction while the war has been going on for over 3 years now. And this sort of reflects the initial assumption that basically after the sort of Ukraine sort of resistance, that Russia would actually stop in its tracks for a variety of reasons, either political or economic. And this hasn't happened, so we have this, in a way, more urgent discussion about reconstruction, but also while the war is ongoing. And this has major implications, not only in terms of economic resources, of funds available, but also what is very important for reforms in terms of actually time horizons. And in the midst of the war still, and given what we've seen, as Paul, you said, with the US, the time horizons are still very short in Ukraine. We're talking 3 to 6 months, because this is what basically war effort entails, and especially in such a sort of precarious international context. So we know from my experience that, how little we know what makes basically reform happen. It is a really sort of non-linear, sort of precarious process. And we've seen this sort of disjuncture in Ukraine between basically building human capacity, human capital. So in terms of individual expertise, after 30 years of working on Ukraine and the region, I'm delighted to see the new generation of people. We've seen it in Belarus with the protests and now activists, but we also see it in Ukraine, a new generation of experts, of state officials. But what the experience of the past tells us, that there is always this mismatch between human basically potential or human capital and institutional reforms. And institutional reforms tend to need time and stability, and that's much more difficult to achieve. So we've seen sort of surges and the availability of human capital resulting in reforms across various sectors, but this has never been done in a sort of linear way, all good things at the same time. We know that any reform process, despite the best desire of the donors and international organizations, from the IMF, World Bank to the EU, to see it as a technical process. You just sort of create a framework, you create sort of timelines, and you deliver funds, and then things happen. In nowhere this works like this. So we've had a lot of sort of focus on what needs to happen, and a lot of, I would say, very sophisticated papers written, especially, by Italian and German colleagues when they were working sort of on the sort of big conferences. And yet this, we know the process is much more hesitant and precarious. And from that point of view, it's really this strategic patience which is needed from international donors and long-term commitment. But also, as Berend no doubt will let us confirm this, we need this international capacity to be able to understand and to know what's happening and to have this strategic patience. We know from the war in Georgia that international donors rushed to Georgia, and Georgia was almost flooded with assistance, with very sort of competing or overlapping objectives, projects, and flooding. And the Georgian government at a certain point had to sort of rein in this process, and they started being much more discriminate. But this is premised on institution building when it comes to international managing international assistance. And we know from Ukraine that experience that it's much easier to encounter very good reformers, very good individuals who work as networks rather than to build strong and coherent institutions. So in a way, Ukraine is much better at firefighting, dealing with urgent problems rather than sort of developing sort of strategies, programs, and implementing them in a sustainable way. And if it is not enough in a way to problematize the context, I'll just focus on perhaps the sheer scale of the challenge. But because when we talk about reconstruction, we actually what we are dealing with is basically humanitarian sort of assistance in terms of helping people to rebuild their housing, roads and bridges, schools, etc. But also we are talking about modernization, for example, of infrastructure in the meantime, like water supplies. And this is especially important because this is linked to European integration and preparation for membership, where issues, for example, like clean water is one of the requirements. And that means extensive sort of work at the local level in every village and town to ensure that basically water pipes are fit for purpose. So we have an enormous agenda, and when we talk about reconstruction, we tend to focus, basically, it seems that we all link it together. And what we know, just in terms of international donors, what we know that donor coordination is fundamental, is essential. And what we've seen is a lot of rushing from all kinds of actors, including EU member states, but also, for example, China expressing interest in reconstruction. But what is really needed to avoid a piecemeal, fragmented, chaotic approach? Donor coordination is needed because, as Berend knows from his experience, speaking with one voice makes it much more sort of powerful, and domestic actors cannot pick and choose. So stronger conditionality, one voice, and knowing the context. There are always people who know very little but are keen to do well and jump in, are parachuted in, and basically EU officials who've worked on Ukraine and supported the reforms are very familiar with this. So this is sort of the context. And perhaps the final point, just very briefly, which I will touch on, is we always talk about anti-corruption measures. And if we look at the literature on international development, we basically see those two arguments. One is sort of focusing on the upstream process, building sort of robust, strong institutions, basically staffed with competent, sort of professional and neutral sort of civil servants, versus downstream process that we have basically were able to pick on and punish corruption. It seems that a lot of international attention is on anti-corruption measures, and it is focusing on the downstream aspect, which is very important, but it can never deal with basically replace institution building. And this goes back to the point which I said at the beginning, that institution building, it's something that Ukraine has struggled with. But as I said, the war and generational change, which cannot be underestimated. The human potential in Ukraine is formidable. The ability to network is formidable. And we see already, even when it comes to the knowledge of the acquis, what we call, what Ukraine is known for, this sort of WhatsApp government. We can see coordination happening. So whereas we sort of don't see the same progress, perhaps very gradual sort of process in terms of institution building, we certainly see those informal networks which already help Ukraine to prepare for basically membership preparations for membership. But I will just come back perhaps to the very final point now. There is no, as we know from experience, there is no better prompt for reform than actually the prospect of EU membership. It's not enough, as we know from the Western Balkans, but we know that it helps immensely in terms of doing the necessary institutional reforms and legal changes as well, legal harmonization. And from that point of view, what worries me as we speak of today in terms of institution sort of building or rebuilding, this really depends on the credibility of the EU. And we see sort of the lack of reforms of the enlargement process within the EU seems actually to undermine the credibility of the EU. So I'm a bit concerned that we talk about sort of many people hope on European integration being like a sort of magic wand, which will help. And it already seems that a lot has been done, but I'm just slightly concerned about this not being, the EU not having the right of credibility, because paradoxically the EU hasn't done its own homework on enlargement. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Katarina. So I think that you've given us a good framework to think about, to keep in mind through the rest of this conversation today, between the human potential on the one hand and the institutional reforms on the other. And you've sort of ended with bringing the EU into the picture and its role. But along the way, you've raised this important point about how sometimes international donors tend to rush in. What we also need to be a challenge that needs to be kept in mind is preventing international donors from rushing out as well. And that long-term commitment that you mentioned is extremely important if reform processes are going to work out and and bear fruits. So thank you for your remarks. We will now turn to Katia Lozka, who recently defended her PhD thesis at Ghent University, where her dissertation was on the topic of violence and resistance in Belarus and Ukraine. Previously, Katia was a research fellow at the University of Oxford's Oxford-Belarus Observatory, the forerunner of our own project here. She was a visiting researcher at Vienna University and also at the University of Tartu, and a research fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Her research has appeared, among other places, in East Europe, in the journals East European Politics, European Security, and Problems of Post-Communism. I know that Katia, you recently published some research into how the Ukrainian expert community, academics and civil society think tanks have lobbied for international support for Ukraine's cause and its reform efforts. So I'd like to ask you, please, to give us an overview of how non-state actors in Ukraine contribute to the reform processes. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. In my initial remarks, I will follow up on this remarkable human capital potential that was earlier mentioned, as I will particularly focus on the expert professionals in Ukraine, including think tankers, academics, but also civil society actors, the role that they play in times of war, but also how the role they play in the reform process. Obviously, the reform process in times of war, but also beyond it, is part of the agenda not only of the political leadership of Ukraine, but even more so of the broader civil society and other actors, such as the ones I mentioned, think tanks, academics, other expert professionals, although these categorizations might overlap in the specific context of Ukraine. During the first year of the escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine, together with Dr. Vera Aksionova, we conducted a study on Ukrainian think tankers, their public diplomacy efforts, the role that they play, how some of these practices changed. So in my remarks, I want to zoom out on some of those insights from our research and to make a few remarks on some of the activities of different knowledge-producing actors in times of war, but also how this is linked to the reform process. So although usually relations of states with other states or international organizations are looked at through the state-centric perspectives, as I've said, there are a lot more actors that are involved in the process, such as EU accession or be it the reform process in the bottom-up manner. And when we talk about the Ukraine's reform process, which is very closely linked to the EU accession agenda, they're even more so shaped and pushed for by the broader civil society and the actors which might be included therein. Both the 2004 Orange Revolution, but also the Revolution of Dignity of 2013-14 introduced a new dynamic in the Ukraine's pro-European aspirations that had been expressed already in the 90s, but also in the stages in its access to the European Union. So in particular, after the Euromaidan, we have seen an unprecedented growth of Ukrainian civil society, but also think tanks, with now around 90 think tanks being based all across Ukraine, but most of them are based in the capital city of Kyiv. So today, expert professionals from civil society, think tanks, and other organizations play one of the key roles in lobbying for Ukraine's EU integration agenda and the reform process. So when it comes to negotiations around the EU accession and the reform agenda, think tankers and other professionals in a way engage in a parallel diplomacy to that of the state, having direct contact with both international partners on the one hand, but also domestic agents, both the government and the broader society and population. And oftentimes they serve either as a link between them or as a watchdog, exercising or trying to exercise oversight over what is happening in the government or over some of the decisions. They provide analytical support to the Ukrainian government, try to oversee the reform process, do monitoring of the ongoing reform agenda. So these activities range from taking part in directly in diplomatic negotiations and advising relevant actors to organizing some events that engage foreign publics. However, all of this was challenged heavily with the escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine in February 2022, the event which had a big impact on the way Ukrainian knowledge-producing community operated, and this raised the need for their adaptation. So what we see is that since the start of the aggression, many such actors were left with no safe space to continue many of those activities which I mentioned, organization of events and discussions. Some offices were relocated, some experts, academics had to leave the country. A lot of projects were put on a standstill. And talking about this long-term commitment that was touched upon earlier, in our research, we also encountered some reports that certain donors had halted their funding for a while in 2022 or paused it before some of those projects were resumed, but some of them were not. So this all means that the traditional ways or the ways how this community operated of Ukrainian expert professionals changed. Also, a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals, they shifted their focus of attention also towards other activities such as volunteering activities, donations. Some were recruited into the army, which has had also a huge impact on the way those organizations operate. So we all could see perhaps some photos also of some of the Ukrainian professors or some also experts from other organizations who continued, for example, teaching from the trenches on the battlefield and still giving lessons to the students. Following this initial period of shock and big changes, we have seen some transformations in the ways these professionals, but also organizations adapted and came up with some alternative ways how they engage both with the government and with the international partners, in particular with the European Union. So on the side of the government, we've seen that the martial law introduced certain restrictions and limitations, which led to the problems with the transparency of some data and the availability of some of it. And this is closely linked to one of the key functions that those expert professionals aim to exercise, namely to function as a watchdog over the activities of the government. So in the context of the full-scale invasion, oftentimes those actors face a dilemma, on the one hand of expressing the importance of having constructive critique to drive domestic reforms, but on the other hand, still the necessity to be mindful of the context of war and making sure that certain narratives and outcomes do not aid Russian propaganda or do not reinforce certain narratives about Ukraine. And talking to some of the experts who actively travel internationally, engage with international stakeholders, we've seen that we've seen their willingness to still voice those concerns to the international partners, especially, albeit in a somewhat different manner, as many of those concerns are voiced behind closed doors in closed meetings rather than made public, but they're still there. Concerning the international actors, during the, as I've mentioned, the first year of full-scale invasion left no safe space to continue some of the formats of interaction that were typical before. So discussions, some events also over the reform process and so on was no longer possible in Ukraine. So in the past 3 years, we have seen a remarkable extension of international cooperation. Some organizations, some think tanks, for example, Ukrainian Prism, have now a branch in Brussels. Some started to co-organize events that are now taking place regularly. For instance, since 2023, the same Ukrainian Prism has an expert forum in cooperation with the Stockholm Center for East European Studies in Sweden. So this format of cooperation become more and more regular, and these international collaborations also attempt to inform about the reform process and the challenges which exist there. So we also see a lot of attempts as part of lobbying for pro-Ukraine agenda, but also EU accession, attempts to reach out to broader audiences, some of them which might be less expected, even some audiences we had also some expert professionals who even gave talks about the situation in Ukraine, but also EU accession in churches or also to the university students, some formats which were less typical in the earlier periods. So to conclude, I want to say that it's also the Ukrainian expert professionals, think tankers, academics, other professionals who have an impact and who play a role in how Ukraine interacts with international actors on the topic of reforms and EU accession in particular. Obviously, the context of war heavily influences the situation and in some way restricts the potential of professionals and influences the agenda and how it's implemented. However, those actors are also likely to play a big role in post-war reconstruction, building on those networks and building on those cooperations which have been set in place in the past years. Thank you. I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Katia. That's a fascinating insight into how some of these expert communities are working, how they've had to adapt and resources have been shifted. You made a comment on expressing criticism of part of the oversight watchdog function, that experts were still providing criticism, but perhaps often behind closed doors, because one thing that is very important to keep in mind is that there are multiple audiences for everything that's said publicly, and of course some things do feed into a narrative that is undesirable. Russia is very quick to Russian commentators are very quick to pick up on certain comments and amplify them. And so it's very tricky to provide that oversight in the context of ongoing hostilities. So thank you for your remarks. I would like to remind our audience that questions can be submitted in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Our next speaker is Olena Miliienko, who is an academic and practitioner in public law and politics. Dr. Miliienko has over 10 years' experience working in leading roles in the public sector in Ukraine and nearly a decade's experience in academia as Associate Professor of Law at Donetsk National University, as a professor at the Open International University of Human Development, Ukraine, and she is currently visiting associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies here at the University of Warwick, where I think I'm right in saying she is a British Academy fellow. So Olena, we've heard from Katia about the Ukrainian expert community's efforts to mobilize support for reforms. And I would like to ask you about foreign investment and the Ukrainian business environment, and how Ukraine can attract investors for reforms and its business. I know that you have some slides that you would like to share, and I think you should be able to share them if you and you can. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for such a lovely presentation and good words. What I would like to talk about, first of all, I want to say that there is lots of things going on in Ukraine, but it's also lots of misunderstanding and not really understand the current situation in Ukraine. So how we can change that and what can be done to facilitate international investment?
Olena, can I just,
yes.
Do you want to put your slides on full screen so that we don't see
yeah, just try to do that.
Okay.
Is it
Sorry,
okay now?
Yes.
Yeah? Oh, great. Okay. So what we should do to make it more attractive, and the main point is more understandable for investment in the businesses which is affected by the war. My current research is about relocated enterprises, so I will briefly tell about that. Is enterprises that move from the region of which is not safe to the region which is more safe in Ukraine, and the other businesses that are affected by the war. So what we can say that it's really lots of things going on in Ukraine, and it's understandable that lots of damage, and we see that it's counted by the different researchers, especially of Kyiv School of Economics, of this damage that we have to enterprises and current situation in Ukraine, which is show us that it's becoming more and more different issues for the businesses, and it's also make this influence for the international investment to be scary and aware of making a real investment in Ukraine. But it's not only the issues of that we have the problem of enterprises, it's also a very big problem of people losing their jobs and have no possibility to keep going with their life, which put much more obligation to the state to support them socially. So you can see that now on the screen which sectors really have the biggest part of the damage and what should be done to make the investment see these parts, and what can be done by authority and by people. So as we see, of course, is damage growing, and we can't count everything because lots of information is not available still because it's in occupied territory. But from what we can see, there's really a huge amount of money. From the different parts of Ukraine, we can see that most of the parts, of course, is understandable, is near the coastline, like the main line of the war right now. But in Kyiv, it's also lots of damage of the different enterprises. So what's going on? People moving in the 2022, it was lots of people who move and was internally displaced people, but then some of them go back, and it's also the movement of enterprises, of business was done, and we can see that some going quite not so much from 2013 till 2022, but then this changed a lot after full-scale invasion and people suffering. Of course, there are lots of damage for their personal life and for a different situation. Some people move back, and this situation was internally displaced and relocated enterprises. It changed a lot. So to invest in this type of businesses, which is damaged by war or which had to relocate it by war, we can see that it's a huge amount of relocated enterprises. You can see it now, which move and they are now in much more safer area. They are from different part of Ukraine, and they really need investment. Unfortunately, we can see that state support them, but they can't support too much, of course, because they have lots of other challenges. And that's why it's very important to show the international investment this possibility to invest in relocated business and the business that had some damage. So in one of the example, what I can share with you is a Vinnytsia example. It's a city in the middle of Ukraine, and lots of enterprises move to the city. State authority try to create very good conditions for this relocated enterprise. Is creating the industrial parks, which can give lots of places for employees to work there. Businesses move there, and it's given a possibility to the region to be more sustainable development, but also to create new places of jobs. This region, particularly Vinnytsia, is very good in the food. So they have lots of things that is good because they have a good soil and lots of that. Other region, for example, is IT sector, and IT sector is the Carpathia region was very good. They created favorable condition for businesses which relocated from different areas to create IT cluster, and in the Carpathia region they do that good, but still we see that sometimes people struggling with finding work in IT industry as well. So if we see the picture of investment during the period of time before the war, if we'll see from the 2002 till the full-scale invasion, this process started. So investment come from the different region, from different country. Unfortunately, we're not having a lot of time to discuss all that cases. So I can say that it was really becoming seen. So Ukraine will be a very favorable, good condition for the other countries come and invest to Ukraine. But in the period of time after the war started in 2015, we can see that different trends was following, and these trends try to improve, especially tax law. So that's my main point for today to discuss, that tax law is not always understandable for creating this good investment. So we can say that taxation in Ukraine sometimes is high, but not always. And lots of challenges. It's not about that it's a high tax rate. Much more is about that it's not understandable for investors how to deal, because this taxation law is very complicated. When you introduced me, you mentioned that I have experience leading position in the sector in Ukraine. Yes, I work in court, and this court was deal with tax cases, and we was overmeal with the tax cases in that court, and most of this tax cases was because legislation is very hard to understandable, very complicated, lots of gaps, and for even people inside Ukraine is quite hard to deal with that. But for investments from abroad is awful. So I think that we really need to focus in Ukraine to make this taxation law as clear as possible. Because of this complexity of tax law, it also becomes a challenge and used, for example, by Russian source as well. They say that there is lots of corruption in Ukraine, but sometimes it's not a corruption. Sometimes it's just legislation is not good. I try to explain what I mean. For example, like they say, oh, okay, we have lots of corruption in Ukrainian courts, but if we will dive deeply in that, we will understand that court have a good decision, but they based on the bad legislation. Yeah, because court need to deal with that legislations they have. And the problem is not because of corruption, but because this legislation is not very good. So I think that one of reforms that can really help to make this benefits for investment and to make the understandable how to invest, especially in these enterprises which relocated, was affected by the war, is making tax benefits and understandable for investment, that if they will invest in this business, they will have some benefits for some certain period of time. Maybe tax credits, discounts, also stimulating employment, because, for example, now we have such initiative that if you take some employers from IDPs people, you will have more like some benefits, and it's stimulated for them to focus on this target people. Also, it's very good to create some kind of investment guarantees, because it's also understandable for investment that there is lots of issues, it's a high risks, and they want to understand how they can be protected. So it's also good things to do. Of course, we need to understand how to make it less bureaucracy, as much as possible electronical. We have a good platforms, for example, like platform, and it could be done something like that for taxation as well. Ukraine tried to create it, but still lots of things that should be done not by electronic system. So it's one of the things that could be done good. Of course, it's very good to have the international cooperation, and for that should be a good engagement in international financial institutes to provide grants, loans, technical assistance for affected business. And to wrap up my speech, and I will be very happy to answer your question then, I would like to say that I'm doing now my research and have lots of interviews with different people who are from IDPs. They have their businesses and they try to survive in Ukraine. And they not really ask even about money. They much more ask about help in some information, in some understanding, because they also not really understand where to find investment and how to deal with other things. And that stop people because they have a lack of information. So from authority, I think the main point is to make the taxation legislation more clear and understandable, and also to create some informational portal which will help the people who need this investment to understand what steps they need to do to have this investment. So that's all for now, and I will be very happy to discuss that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Olena. Could you stop sharing your screen, or I can do that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So on that, just on your very last point there, I was a bit, did you mean that the investors or businesses in Ukraine want information?
Both. So my current research is with IDP, so the people who move into Ukraine, and also for people who live now abroad. So, and from both sides, they complain that they have lack of information. So people inside Ukraine, they don't know how to reach these people who are abroad, and people who could like potentially invest, they not really understand the Ukrainian taxation law and other things. So they have a lack of information how to do that properly.
Okay, all right. So there's actually a couple of things there. There's partly a sort of matchmaking as well, putting people,
yes,
connecting people together, as well as providing the clarity of how taxation and such forth works.
Just to answer your question, when I was studying like a student taxation law, it was awful because Ukrainian taxation law is the awfulest ever. It's very complicated. So if it's for lawyers complicated, how it could be complicated for the people who are not lawyers, and especially for the people who live abroad and don't understand our system at all.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think tax law is complicated in most jurisdictions, frankly, but I take your word for it that it's particularly complicated in Ukraine. Okay, thank you. So we will next turn to Berend, who is an honorary research fellow in the Institute for Global Sustainable Development, also here at the University of Warwick, and a senior research fellow in the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He previously worked for the European Commission in various roles, including as head of cooperation in the EU delegation to Ukraine between 2014 and 2018. So, Berend, we've heard about some of the actors involved in reform processes. We've heard about many of the challenges in these processes. And in fact, we have already heard a little bit about oversight and coordination of international assistance, but that's what I was going to ask you to give us a little bit more information about. I know that human resource capital is something that you are particularly interested in raising awareness of. And again, it has actually been mentioned by a couple of the speakers already, but I will give you the floor for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let me first make a bit of a general point, also looking at from some distance. If we see internationally in war and conflict situations, I think we have all to see Ukraine has succeeded in mobilizing quite a substantial increase in its financial assistance, but in conjunction with reforms. And that's in itself, I think, quite a thing. Let's look a little bit back the period before 22. reforms were ongoing after the Euromaidan. And I think there have been a number of successes. In particular, the banking sector, I think, is worth to mention, but also the decentralization, the public procurement, the police reorganization. And in several other sectors, and I will not go into further details there, we have also seen progress, although quite a lot of it was, of course, work in progress. I think it is very important because what Katarina mentioned with regard to, yes, we come across a new generation and lots of brilliant people who are working on these things. The institutional building part of it is maybe slower, but especially taking care of what has been going on over the years is an important basis. I mean, these are the foundations for the institutions. There are good experiences, bad experiences, and at a certain moment it's not a matter of rejecting everything or saying now we are going to do everything better. No, it is a matter of the continuous struggle and building on these things, and I think this is extremely important. Obviously, and this has been mentioned by all of you, 22 was a setback in the reform processes, but the then transition into candidate membership is taken back actually the process. And I think my impression is that it is really back on track. And also what is interesting here to see in terms of oversight and coordination is that the accession conditions, as well as what the World Bank is asking, as well as what the IMF is asking, this has been put together, as well as also what the government of Ukraine wants to achieve. Obviously, of course, this all is interlinked, but we got in 2024 the reforms matrix, which combined, and I must say I found it staggering, the numbers, over 300 conditionalities and recommendations, and there's a huge matrix made, but they updated. I've seen it now in 2025. I must admit I have not read it in detail, but I think it is an impressive tool, and it shows that things are ongoing. Here, then on the Ukrainian side, to mention basically a few institutions that are working on these things and are providing this kind of information. And again, this is all at a fairly high and, if you want, abstract level. I mean, the Recovery and Reforms Delivery Office was set up already well before 22, but continues working, is the main interlocutor, is the secretariat for the Ukrainian donor platform. And here, I think we have a good instrument where at the basically highest level among the donors, we are sitting together on a regular basis, reviewing what's ongoing. Also then, of course, the organization of the annual Ukraine Recovery Conferences. What is lacking there, or what we're coming to, and I will come at the end also to that, is of course when we talk about the concrete actions on the ground. But in itself, these are instruments, or these are setups which are extremely important. And many other countries that are in comparable situations or were in comparable situations do not have such kind of infrastructure. So I think this is an extremely positive part. With regard to the civil society, I think it was already mentioned in involvement. I think especially also Katia's reference to her research, etc. But maybe to mention concretely Rise Ukraine, which brings together about 50 public organizations, but also some government agencies, etc., which is producing on a weekly basis good overviews of what is ongoing with regard to donor activities. It also laid the groundwork for the DREAM software, which is quite a sophisticated exercise, basically registering, administering projects across Ukraine. And finally, I think also in the same line, which was existing very much before and did a great job after 2014, is of course the reanimation package of reforms, which still continues, in particularly following where it comes to EU integration. I think those are a couple of institutions or organizations or setups that are today available and that are functioning. Now, having said all of that, and I think it's good to keep that in mind, apart from regaining the territorial control and safeguarding of national sovereignty, the security, I think one of the most critical issues on this whole thing, and this has been mentioned several times, is the issues related to human resource capacity and the centralization versus decentralization in decision-making on reconstruction and public services. And I think the two are, in my opinion, quite closely linked. When it comes to the need for international funding on reconstruction, this will continue and it will even increase probably substantially more. At the same time, Ukraine has a high economic potential, and I would say it can support long-term financing and credits, no matter how it all goes, if you develop it properly. But it requires the conducive environment for investments, democratic and effective governance, and adequate human resource capacities. And I think Olena already put forward a very much detailed, but not I think quite an important aspect of the taxation. But I think that's typically an example of a conducive environment. I would like to make here also, or add this thing, this is contrary to what I would call toxic exploitative agreements on a compulsory sharing of future benefits from natural resources. Very unfortunately, it seems that at this very moment, the signature of this agreement is ongoing. An agreement is an agreement, whatever you think about it, but it's a very strange way of approaching the situation that hopefully will be post-war. The question is, does Ukraine and the international community do the maximum possible to train and prepare the war-affected population, those displaced inside and outside the country, as well as also fighting in the military, the kind of human resources that we need for a democratic and prosperous society? Restoring and reinforcing Ukraine's human resource capacity is key to planning, execution, and oversight of the reconstruction process, continuing reforms in governance, and the accession to the EU. When it comes to the numbers, and those are staggering, of people that are displaced within the country, and I think Olena showed us how we get an imbalance in a way towards the West, which is logic, everybody goes there. But of course, there's also the East that is at the moment depopulated, and what to do once we get into a peace process, once we get post-war. These areas need additional attention. Then we have over 5 million people out in Europe. How do we get them back? And I think there's a lot has been written about this, but also challenging is, of course, the reintegration of the veterans. And huge numbers of men, and a bit less, but also women, who are directly affected by the fighting, etc., who are fighting, need to be reintegrated back into society and have to be offered the necessary economic and social perspectives. Now, when it comes to higher and professional education, skill training, professional coaching, all of this plays an important role in Ukraine. And this is not only to restore the pre-war situation, but also to adjust to the rapidly increasing demands for new and evolving situation in the country. Many people will have to learn new skills. There are many occupations where people will not return. It's a lot of changes that are going to come. How are we going to get people in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the knowledge and the skills they need for it? And this will require a drastic augmentation in the professional and the higher and professional education. It is building back better on higher and vocational education needs a thorough reform and reorganization of the institutions, curricula, and course content. There are a number of initiatives going on this, but don't forget the numbers of institutions that have been destroyed or affected by the war. I mean, we have roughly an estimation is over 1,300 universities, higher education colleges, vocational training schools. Probably about a third or more is affected, and several are really destroyed. Now, when it comes to the attention to this, last year in the Ukraine Support Conference, there was the Skill Alliance, brought with lots of noise, in itself a good idea, but there's little evidence that this has led to a comprehensive approach of addressing the restoration and reinforcement of human resource capital, which I think is very important for this reconstruction process. Also, of course, just to mention it, lots of international assistance has gone into, and I think some of you are also benefiting from that. We support people studying in Europe, but also when it comes to the support for the refugees, there is lots of investments in language training, in skill training, but especially that is geared up towards the market here in Western Europe, rather than to the market or to the demands which we would have in the East. A lot of it can easily be used, but we remain, of course, with quite a number of people that probably in the end of the day will stay in Western Europe. Few interventions explicitly address the countering of the brain drain and aim at the preparation of expertise for reconstruction and future EU integration. I think there are a couple of universities that work on this. Kiev School does work on it. The consortium of Global Ukrainian University is a good thing. I think Katarina is involved in the Natalin for Capacity Building program, which is typically a good example. There were some small initiatives at Warwick, but much more needs to be done. Then now to want to make the link to decentralization before I stop just a little bit more. Intrinsically related to the concerns on adequate human resource capacity is the importance to maintain and reinforce local capacity to implement reconstruction and further development of the delivery of public services. There was a good reform on decentralization, but there's at the moment very much a trend of centralizing various aspects, which is logic given all the difficulties there are, but it carries a risk. And of course, it is very much mentioned because there's a shortage of human resources. And in this way, the two are linking very much together. And this is why it is so much necessary to invest in it. It is not only about a couple of brilliant people, about IT systems, etc. I mean, this is very important, no doubt about it. But it is about the broader basis of people across the country, across the oblast, across the hromadas that need to be capable of managing these processes. If we do not have that capacity locally, there are obvious risks, not in the least, that concentrations generally risk also return of corruption that was actually to some extent, I think it was locally, reasonably successfully countered by the decentralization process. Now, my final word on this is bringing together the wide range of existing support activities and plans. I mean, there are all sorts of initiatives going on. There is need for a comprehensive strategy to restoring Ukraine's human resource capital. And this is the kind of strategies that should look into all aspects of return and resettlement, of internal and external displaced population, reintegration of veterans, and also the institutional reforms in the higher and professional education. And then, of course, what are all the international and financial and institutional assistance can play. This thing is lacking today. At least I'm not able to find it or to see it. And I think also listening to what came out of this presentation, it observes this. I think also what is important to mention, that's my final word on this, is the earlier experiences on joint coordination of government and international donors in support of decentralization, as also the approach which we, for example, have been mounting a couple of years back on the Ukraine reform architecture, offer good examples of successful operational coordination. I mean, one is indeed the coordination at the highest level, which I was starting with my inputs, but the other one is extremely important, that you talk at operational level and not a matter of, and there, of course, and I think here very much like what Katarina was coming with, everybody is rushing in with projects and Denmark is giving this and Norway is doing that, and France will want to do this, how to bring this together and indeed have it operationally properly put together. For that, it is very much necessary to have this joint operational approach to restore and reinforce Ukraine's human capital. And this is quite essential in complementing the well-organized, I think pretty well-organized political and technical coordination of the ongoing, both, I think, military and financial assistance. I think this is, without wanting to go into details, but we can of course discuss this if there are more questions. I'd like to leave it by this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berend. There's of course, we all know there is a huge job ahead for Ukraine. One thing that with our webinars on Ukraine and for quite different reasons, Belarus, is that they often sound quite gloomy. So I held on to the fact that at the beginning there, Berend, you commented that you, with a positive note, that things were back on track. And so maybe that's something that we can develop our thinking on. And we may also want to come back to these questions of education and decentralization. I'd just like to remind the audience that they can put questions into the Q&A box. Berend, could you just mute yourself, please? Thank you. So we have a couple of questions, and I have a question for each of the panel. So we'll ask a question going through in the order that you spoke, but I'll give a question for each of you. I'll give all of the questions now so that Katarina will have a little bit of time to think before she answers. But the question for Katarina, you mentioned China and China's interest in some of the infrastructure rebuilding in Ukraine when the war stops. And there is this competition of different actors to be involved. And China and the EU in different ways are looking at what happens in Ukraine. And I just wondered, how far should we be welcoming different people wanting to be involved, or how much should we be concerned as Europeans about China's keenness to invest in Ukraine? Should we be seeing that through an economic lens or through a geopolitical lens? So that's my question for you, which I will come back to in a moment. Katia, Berend there was mentioning the diaspora, and you said in your remarks about how some of these think tanks had taken their operations into exile, and of course many people were called up as well that were working in think tanks. I just wondered if you could say something about the benefits and the drawbacks to these kinds of non-governmental organizations from time spent in exile, but also how likely it is that those operations will return to Ukraine in the near future. For Olena, a similar question, actually. Again, you showed us a map indicating how a lot of enterprises have moved and relocated their operations to the western part of Ukraine, or central and western Ukraine is probably more accurate description. And again, Berend actually picked up on this. Should we be expecting those enterprises to return their operations? Because presumably there are opportunity costs to them as individual enterprises in that, though there are also important benefits to Ukraine of having everything having them return. So I just wonder how you see, if you could speculate a little on how that plays out. How will it require inducements? Will it, and where might they come from? And then Berend, my question for you, you mentioned good and bad experiences. We heard from Katarina about a little bit about what happened in Georgia, and I'm aware that you have a long experience working in EU institutions. I just wondered if I could press you on what you think the best models and the worst model is that you've seen over your career. Yeah, so those are my first questions for each of you, and then we have a couple of questions from the audience, which I'll come to in a moment. So we'll go to Katarina first, please. So the question was about how concerned we should be about China, or whether we should welcome it.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is a very sort of good question. I haven't seen much analysis on the role of China, but building sort of on the more general knowledge of China, this is a very good, very sort of complex question, because we know that when China comes, it offers relatively easy money. So it looks, at least it looked to the countries like Montenegro. So it looks like relatively sort of streamlined sort of investment. But for example, China always likes to keep it sort of fairly secretive and exclusive. So it brings its own workforce, and its own companies. Chinese workforce may be actually, in the context of labor shortages in Ukraine, may be desirable, but China doesn't cooperate with other actors. It likes to deal with the governments. It likes to do it basically on a bilateral basis. So it doesn't like to do coordination. And we have the bigger problem that the China's reputation is stained by its support for Russia and a lack of condemnation of Russia as such, and the use of Chinese soldiers. So it seems to me that China may be interested in Ukraine, especially in the context of access to the EU market. As long as the membership perspective is credible, with sort of caveats, for example, even when it comes to Hungary, and as we speak, the referendum on Ukraine's accession, China will be very interested in Ukraine and access to the EU market. So investment. Having said that, the type of operations that China favors, I see it quite difficult to do. Having said that, sorry, there are lots of sort of nuances here. China is incredibly good and delivering sort of complex projects very quickly, like sort of fast trains. So from that point of view, China, it's also when we have this, what we talked about in terms of investment climate, of the tax regime, of donor coordination, discussions between Kyiv and the regions, in terms of how should basic projects be delivered, built, China actually has a template to do it very quickly and effectively. And unfortunately, we in Europe are not as good in terms of delivering those large infrastructural projects which Ukraine needs in terms of connectivity, especially, and green technology. So it's a complex picture, multi-layered, and ultimately, I think Ukraine's position is going to be swayed by the position of Europe, of the EU, which seems to be divided on China at the moment. So there are lots of sort of variables here, and I'm reluctant to make my pick at the moment.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, as you say, there is an urgency, and China can do things quickly, but it does come with a lot of unspoken tacit conditionality, if I can put it that way. The EU may not have the insidious effect, but sometimes the EU is just too slow, and that may present some challenges and be so thank you. But I'll move to Katia now. The question was about the benefits and drawbacks of expert community spending time in exile.
Yes, thank you for this question. I'll be quite brief. So obviously the escalation of the war has had a huge impact and transformed the Ukrainian diaspora in Europe and beyond. And this also means that now there are many expert professionals who indeed reside in Europe, who play a much more active role in the activities of the diaspora and sometimes become the drivers of those activities or engage diaspora into some events and activities with policymakers and so on and so forth. However, while on the one hand, we did see the disruption of activities and the need to leave the country, we also do not see the exodus of the expert community from Ukraine. What is happening is that people are coming back to Ukraine, traveling back to Europe. This is a much more popular way of how this adaptation happened. But also we need to keep in mind the martial law and the restrictions which are linked to leaving the country for certain members of the expert professionals who actually cannot go to Europe and who to the EU, but who stay in Ukraine and continue to do the activities, participate in events from Ukraine, sometimes under unspeakable conditions. And also during the study that we conducted, we also interviewed a few people in Ukraine with also the electricity cuts and so on and so forth. So this is the situation that has not changed. So while indeed there are people who had to flee and some people who have spent maybe more time abroad. Normally, this is not, this situation does not mean that this is, the people fled the country, like, for example, I mean the diaspora in Belarus, right, that they do not come back. So here we see something more dynamic, that there are attempts at establishing international cooperations and also at the organization of some events also now in Ukraine, also academic conferences, like, for example, Ruta conference that happens, takes place in June in the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine. So this is also one of the formats that says that some things are actually coming back. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Olena, a question about enterprises relocating back when the war stops.
Thank you for this question, because it's really good to know, and I can say already we see a different dynamic. That's why my research is always ongoing, because the situation changed. So even we don't really need to wait until the war stops. We already see that some enterprises, they come back because, for example, it was occupied the Kiev, near the Kiev territory, and lots of enterprise, they go to the different part of the country. But when its territory go back to Ukrainians under control of Ukrainian, they come back home. But we saw two dynamics. First dynamic is that when the situation is better, people just come back and go in with their enterprise as it was. But sometimes people do like two branches. So they keep going with their old one, come back and keep going with the old one, but also try to develop in the new branch in this place where they relocated. So from my perspective, I think that it both okay. The main point and the main task for Ukrainian authority and for the people is to make the conditions and enterprises still inside Ukraine. It's not so matter where inside Ukraine, but still going on inside Ukraine. Why I say that? Because the main problem is that lots of enterprises, they decided to move outside Ukraine. For example, only for the last year, 2024, Ukrainians pay tax in Poland at about 2 billion zlotys. So it's lots of money that could be paid in Ukraine, and Ukraine desperately needs this money. Yeah, but this tax they paid by Ukrainians in different country because of the safety issues. They decided to move to the other country and pay tax there. So I think our main point is just to try to create the good conditions for enterprises and for people stay inside Ukraine. Is one reason is economically, but other is also the human capital, because if people will feel desperately that they can't keep going with their businesses, they will stop their business and they will go abroad like refugee. And then they will ask for some social benefits from Europe and so on. So this is not good dynamic. The main point is to stay inside Ukraine and to create as much as possible the condition for people keep going with their businesses or create a new one.
Thank you. And Berend, what is the best of worlds and what is the worst of worlds here when it comes to reforms?
No, it comes basically, I mean, if I understood the question correctly, it is basically about how do you push a coordinated approach at operational levels? And there we have good and bad experiences. What we have seen, we saw it is in 2014-15, after the invasion on the Donbas area, that you get a kind of explosion in what pardon me the word, but the aid industry is coming in, and you get all sorts of organizations and all sorts of projects. And of course, it needs to be coordinated, but you spend quite a lot of time, and you wouldn't want to be the one who is actually the recipient on this. That means respective Ukrainian organizations, authorities, etc., because you have to deal with so many. We see the same again after 22, and a lot of this goes back to the way how, for example, humanitarian aid is organized. And what we see, of course, today is a lot of these projects are semi-humanitarian. Nothing wrong as such with that. I mean, there's very much a need, and probably there is far more need than what can be filled in, but it gives a kind of dispersion of all the efforts and attention, and you have to some way the other way bring this together. Now, I think where it comes to good experiences, I think I mentioned already before, I think the way we tried and have tried actually to support as international community the decentralization process, where at a certain moment you try to start from the beginning of design of interventions of financing, get to common resource frameworks, have very much the national counterparts a leading role in this, but especially also that every organization, somewhere the other way, complies to the common goals. And yeah, you would all say, oh, this is what everybody does in donor coordination. That's true. The only thing is, if you look into the reality and to the outputs, there's quite a difference in that. This you can say at the level of the donor coordination platform that is existing, but that's at a very high level. In fact, they are doing things like that, but then it goes about the billions that are distributed and contributed from the European Union, from the IMF, etc. But what I'm talking here about is, and especially when it comes to, for example, then the whole human resource part, how are we dealing with this? And what today you're having individual projects. Some of them, of course, joint, but then it's quite a dispersed area. And bad experiences, I think it is a matter of going around into a number of countries around the world where we have had war, and it's always a little bit like this. And it has to do also with how donors are functioning. And a donor wants to be profiled. I'm justifying it from my country, and I want to have my program. It's all understandable. And again, if you are the recipient, you will not pose too many questions to that. But also what you're having is the dynamics inside the country. You have various national organizations, and then at a certain moment, ordinary things like job security, etc., are also kicking in. Now, the art is to try to bring this indeed together. And again, I have to stress here, it's the operational part of it. It is not so much the high political part. And I can assure you, this is hard work. Been involved quite a bit in this, both in Ukraine as well as in Belarus. But it is possible to some extent. I hope I have given you some...
Okay, thank you. So I have two more questions. I'll ask they're both quite broad questions. So we'll ask them to the whole panel if they have anything to say on these, and we'll go around in the reverse order. So one question is about specific measures. Can you briefly name the measures? Can you briefly specify the measures to make the activities of state institutions in Ukraine more efficient and transparent? That's the first question. And the second question is about green transition. What is being done to ensure environmental sustainability? So if we go in the back in the reverse order, Berend, so that means starting with you, but if we could keep the answers brief, please. Or you have nothing to say.
I'm afraid I mean, it's exactly this kind of work what I was speaking about, and I think we're talking in particular about, of course, measures that are benefiting from international support. How to get them more transparent. You have to be there. You have to interact, and some way or the other way, you have to take a pragmatic approach on that. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes a little bit less, but there's also local political dynamics, etc. What you have to deal with. I think it is simple as that. When it comes to green transition, it's clear that this is very much on the agendas, and there are several opportunities. At the same time, don't be over ideological or idealistic as to what can be done. I mean, first of all, we are in a war, and hopefully soon in a post-war situation. Things need to be repaired. Things need to get back on track. The economy needs to run again. There are people coming back from the front. There are people coming back from the rest of Europe that are expecting something. So you have to be careful what you are doing. But within that context, I think the kind of solutions for that are well known. And again, here also the whole decentralized, or the mechanisms of decentralized decision making wherever possible, are extremely important.
Okay, thank you. Olena, do you have something to add on these two questions?
Yes, but it is a big challenge because I can talk about both of this question a lot, because about transport, it was my PhD dissertation about that. So I can talk a lot about that, and about ecology. My father is forester in Ukraine, and I can talk about ecology as well as long. But I'll try to be very briefly. So about transparency, what I can say from my experience and as research and as a practical there in Ukraine, we are very transparent. So in our constitution, in our legislation, there's lots of mechanism where there's lots of information that is open access, and people can have access to all this information about what the authority doing. The same with declaration of all things that the public people do. For example, and sometimes it's even too much. For example, my reason why I decided to leave Ukraine to 2022, because I was a member of regional council, and I need to declare everything that I have, where I live, and I was widow with 2 children, so I know if Russian want, they have access to all that information. Where I live, it's not so hard was to find out. So I mean, we're very transparent. We had to declare a lot and so on. The problem and the challenges, I'm really grateful for Berend to mention that, is decentralization reform. What I mean is great reform, and I can say about that because I was a member of regional council from this party of our previous prime minister who pushed this reform, Groisman, who created this decentralization reform. So it was from my political party, and I really know how was doing that. Now it's much worse. So when it really was working with this decentralization reform, there was lots of transparent information. You can see what government do. Hromadas really created a good stuff of the doing things which matter. But now, unfortunately, there is lots of pressure, especially from the office of president, because they have their local representatives, and these local representatives in every region, they are not transparent, and they do lots of problems, and they not really give access for the local authority to create a transparent and good condition. So that's a challenge. And I think the longer it will continue, the worse it will be. So we need to go back to decentralization, and it will be very good to create this condition. And about ecology, there's a huge damage of ecology. So in every field, we can see how the main treasure of Ukraine is fertile soils, and our soils destroyed. It's about, I think, 10% of soils was destroyed, and we don't know how many years we will need to come them back. Some, just 21% of soils in Ukraine destroyed, but damaged, but could be be revealed soon after, because when we have lots of this weapon, it's lots of damage of different things, and some species, some like birds and other animals, they are not exist anymore in this region at all. So they can disappear because of the effects of the war. So of course, it's lots of problem in ecology, and I think it will be, even if the hopefully war will stop soon, we will have lots of years ahead when we will still have the issues with ecology.
Yeah, that's it's quite it's a big area to talk about, and it's sad what war does to the environment as well. Need to be brief because we're coming towards the end. Katia, do you have a couple of sentences? I'll remind you as well that the first question about transparency was also about efficiency.
Yes, I will skip the green question and I will be very brief on the transparency, just to echo what Berend and Olena mentioned, that again, there are two dynamics at play, and one is the international and one what is happening on the ground. And indeed, there are mechanisms inside Ukraine to ensure levels of transparency and accountability, but should the challenges arise, the ones that I was also describing, again, we go back to the question of human capital, that those experts on the ground, like the ones I was talking about, they are quite vocal about those problems domestically. And I think it's one of the ways also to go about it, to inform the public and continue raising those issues in the public domain inside Ukraine, that how this issue could be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being succinct. And Katarina, giving the last word to you, if you would like to add something.
Yes, just to really amplify or sort of echo what's been said already, in terms of basically Ukraine is, as we know, the largest sort of European country, and the regions have also different needs and different possibilities. What is the priority in Dnipro, for example, and the Oblast is very different from Transcarpathia. So from that point of view, there are different opportunities and different needs. And it takes us back to the issue that's been mentioned about decentralization and the successes when it comes to the local level. But regional governance has been neglected and re-centralized even more, and undermining the whole transparency and sort of activism. Interestingly, European integration actually requires sort of stronger regional governments, not least to handle EU funding. So that's a strong incentive for Ukraine to be able to cope with pre-accession funds, even when they become sort of available on a massive scale. But there will be basically a necessity for Ukraine in the process of integration actually to develop regional government, regional sort of layer. And this is important because this local knowledge is fundamental, and Ukrainian sort of regions have rather different sort of needs and priorities, understandably, given the size and the war. In terms of, and this also includes, for example, environmental sort of and ecology as such. And this local knowledge is fundamental. And we know that in Ukraine, we see from the sort of experience of decentralization, what phenomenal changes, how quickly they can happen, if and when sort of local communities are basically stakeholders. And from that point of view, this also touches on Green Deal. But I would like to, and basically on environmental concerns, I would like to, first of all, reflect on the complexity. Ukraine at the moment is bombarded with not only sort of pre-accession conditionality and criteria, but also international assistance, and donors come with their own priorities, from gender equality to sort of basic green transition. And that's very often overloading the agenda. So I think perhaps less and better is just, I think Ukraine is being overloaded with all the demands which the donors are formulating. And from that point of view, I think we have to be realistic and pragmatic. In certain areas, local communities can move faster. In other areas, it will, at the national level, it will take longer. So that's something which is actually sort of environmental sort of acquis is very, very costly to implement. And I think Ukraine will have to be very strategic at the national and at regional and local level, what the priorities should be.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's a couple of our speakers there have mentioned the need for a little bit of pragmatism and not being unfair on in expectations on Ukraine. Okay, so thank you very much. I think that our audience will agree that we've had 4 very knowledgeable and engaged speakers on this topic. As I said, the recording will go online. There will also be a policy brief, which I will be writing based on this discussion, which will be distributed soon on through the mailing list and our WebHub website. And let me just say that our final webinar in this current series will be held on the 29th of May, and we will think about something which actually has been touched on today, which is migration, movement of people, but we'll be thinking about migration in the context both of Ukraine and also Belarus. And allow me lastly to mention that we have an in-person conference in London in June. There are already some details on our website for that, where you can register interest if you haven't already. The title is Ukraine, Belarus, and the Complex Geopolitics of Europe. I need to say that space is strictly limited, and while we encourage you to register interest, please wait for us to confirm attendance. So thank you enormously to our 4 panel of speakers for today. Thank you to the audience for questions and for joining us. Thank you to the interpreters, and thank you as well to our partners who helped organise this series at Ukrainian Prism and at the Stockholm Centre for East European Studies. So thank you, everybody, and I hope to see everyone soon. Goodbye.